Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Anna Natsvalavaite. I'm a research fellow here at the Center of Mutual and Co-owned Business, based out of Kellogg College. And it's a real pleasure to be here today at the talk, which is actually planned in alignment with the 8th of March, International Women's Day. Oh, how wonderful. Our last speaker will be joining us. Wonderful.
Sorry, just came out of teaching.
Not at all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. So, Give to Gain is the main theme of our conversation tonight. And if we step back for a moment, what makes this theme particularly interesting is that it challenges a common assumption in economics and business that value creation is primarily competitive. Now, increasingly, both research and practice suggests something slightly different. And that is that when individuals and institutions deliberately give, whether through knowledge, networks, capital, or leadership opportunity, the gains are rarely individual. They tend to be systemic. And they show a stronger organization, more resilient innovation ecosystem, and more inclusive forms of economic growth. So today, we will explore this idea through three complementary perspectives that together shape how change happens in practice. First, we will look at the ecosystem perspective, which helps us to understand the conditions that enable entrepreneurship and innovation to flourish. Then we will look at the capital perspective, examining how investment decisions influence whether ideas and organizations are able to scale. And we will move on to the third perspective, which is the organizational view, where leadership, culture, and operational practice ultimately determine whether opportunity translates into real outcomes. And we're very fortunate this evening to have three fantastic speakers with us, who each bring a very deep expertise across the areas. I will, with great pleasure, introduce Professor Pinar Ozcan, who is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the University of Oxford, and whose work on entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystems has shaped how we understand the institutional conditions that support entrepreneurial growth. Then we have Sabre Collier, who is for the Skoll Centre of Social Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and is an investor working on the intersection of impact investing, capital allocation, and systemic change. And Lucy Turner, who is the Chief Purpose Officer at Game Changer Collective. And she's an entrepreneur who focuses on helping organizations translate purpose and gender equity into sustainable leadership practice. Now, our conversation today will move along a very natural arc, so from evidence to capital to implementation. And I would love to begin with the experiences behind the ideas. So if I may start with you, Pinar, perhaps we could begin, before we start, by a very brief introduction about what work you do. And then I would like to ask you the following question. So from your work on entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystems, could you share a moment where a purposeful give, such as opening access, for example, sharing knowledge, or convening networks, or maybe backing an overlooked talent, created a clear gain? And also, what was the mechanism that made the gain possible?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and with such amazing panelists.
One second, if I just may. I'm sorry. I think I didn't switch the microphone on. Yes, it's on now.
I think you can hear me, right? Okay, perfect. So my work as a professor of entrepreneurship focuses on the ecosystem that supports entrepreneurs And that involves large organizations that may hire that venture in order to work together. It may be investors, angel investors, VCs, impact investors, and of course the general environment, regulators, all of those different stakeholders are part of an entrepreneur's ecosystem. And the word ecosystem, as you know, comes from nature, and it's a collection of organisms that collectively do better, live better, survive better compared to just by themselves. And so particularly in entrepreneurship, especially in fields like medical science and finance, and in many fields the regulatory aspect is very important, and there are just so many different stakeholders that the entrepreneur has to relate to and has to work with. And when it comes to female founders particularly, I think that gap is even bigger, and even the existence of a healthy ecosystem is even more important, because it's not just about the female founder wanting to follow their venture and their passion, but it's about the ecosystem, the investors in the ecosystem also being female, understanding kind of the difficulties that a woman faces in that environment, which is very much not equal. Just to give you some stats, there's one female founder for five male founders in the world right now. And of all the venture capital money, only 2%, not 20%, 2% goes to women. And that is something that we need to change. So one of the beautiful moments that I can describe from my research is last year we published this work, which is about two entrepreneurs, one female and male co-founders, who wanted to, they had done some work in Africa, and they had realized just how many babies actually die due to lack of access to life-saving medicine, especially in areas where there's the water is not clean. So they get a disease and then they just can't fight it off and they die. And one of the things that's also noticeable in many of these kind of last mile areas of Africa is that you can buy a Coca-Cola or a Sprite there, right? So that's an interesting contrast. Like, babies are dying from lack of access to medicine, but, the mother can go and buy a Coca-Cola. And so this thinking outside the box and realizing that the ecosystem isn't just hospitals and pharma companies and the healthcare sector in that country, but perhaps Coca-Cola is also part of the ecosystem, or could be, it was, I think, a beautiful moment when these entrepreneurs said, let's piggyback on Coca-Cola. And they went to Coca-Cola and said, give us the specs of your crates and bottles. And if we design the medicine such that it fits perfectly in between the bottles, will you take it? Mm. And so from that year on, every Coca-Cola crate took life-saving medicine to every last mile village in Africa. And many, many thousands of babies' lives were saved. And now this work is being replicated in other countries because these two entrepreneurs ended up joining the World Health Organization after. And so, to me, the reason why it's beautiful for me is to thinking in ecosystems makes you realize, who can I depend on that wouldn't naturally be part of my environment? And can I invite them to work with me to create win-win situations? Because while Coca-Cola didn't get paid much or anything for this, they got a lot of brownie points in terms of their PR. And so maybe that's one story that I can share.
Thank you. I am absolutely blown away by the data that you have shared. I had no idea how, first of all, little money goes towards female founders. I just didn't have that statistic. And you mentioned the win-win situation. There's so much to be taken away with that. And we really have to speak more about it. I also have never heard of this Coca-Cola story. I don't know how many of the members of the audience have. So thank you, Pinar. What I find also particularly compelling is that there's this reminder that innovation ecosystems are rarely accidental. And they have to be shaped by deliberate decisions about access, collaboration, and institutional support. May I bring you in, Tara? I would love to have you share more about your background with the audience. And the question that I have for you is, from an impact investing lens, perhaps you could share a moment where giving, whether it's patient fair capital, flexible terms, governance support, or just opening doors, has translated into a real gain. And what was operationally different about that particular investment or partnership?
I actually have a few examples. I'm Sabre Collier. I'm a visiting fellow here at the college. I'm a visiting fellow with the Skoll Centre, and I wear a few hats which pertain to, a few other hats which pertain to your query. I'm one of the investors with Shequity, which is a gender lens VC fund deploying across Africa. I'm on the team at Mobilis, which is a UK government facility deploying for emerging markets. It's an emerging markets capital facility. And I'm a senior director at impact investing at Chemonics. And I'll give examples from each because there is a tension with give to gain, right? Ostensibly, this is not a world, when you look at what's going on in the world, you would think no one's going to just give. There is the case when it comes to investing in women that people just believe in these amazing founders. And then there's also the broader commercial and economic case, which has been made for decades, but which we continue to make. So I'll give some examples. With Shequity, we actually started something really new, which is that we're giving grants for carbon credits for entrepreneurs to be trained so that they can access carbon markets. Why would you just give, like you're giving them additional money and then they have to return it, and this, but the reason why we built it in is because there's all of these forces that are affecting the growth of businesses, and more of them being able to sell carbon credits is a way to de-risk these investments for us. It might take 5 or 10 years, but we're willing to make this bet because we also noticed that women were underrepresented in carbon markets. So it was a gift to them, but not really. It's de-risking them for us. Another example, and I love sharing our publications, Mobilist, we recently funded Amundi, which is a big asset manager, Amundi, to do a big research report on gender bonds. And why would a government-backed facility give money to a really big institutional manager? Well, it's because actually, when you look at bonds, this is a huge vessel or vehicle for capital that could be integrating more women. And obviously, if more women, including women-led ventures, are attached and linking into these broader flow of capital sources from bonds, which are obviously favored by institutional investors, the gains to us as a global economy amount to more than 25 trillion in additional GDP from women's economic parity, if we're uplifting more of these businesses.
That is absolutely fascinating. I can see that the audience is finding this is interesting because I am learning. I think I have gained more data in the last 30 minutes than I have read through in the last couple of months, which has entirely shocked me. So higher capital efficiency and a great transfer of wealth. These are really huge changes globally that are happening in the next decade, 2 decades. And I would like to build on that point for a moment, because what your examples have highlighted also is that capital is rarely neutral. I mean, the structure of investment decisions can either reinforce existing patterns or open entirely new opportunities. And it looks like we have a lot of new opportunities coming our way. Now, this brings me to you, Lucy. Again, you are someone who will share with us an organizational perspective where strategy and opportunity ultimately become reality. And if I could also kindly ask you to briefly introduce yourself. But my question for you is, from inside a purpose-driven enterprise Could you share a moment of giving where leadership choices, capability building, culture shift, or perhaps something that is measurable, such as genuinely redistributed power, has made a difference and a deeper impact for women and communities? And what changed in how these organizations worked day to day?
Sure can. So are you ready for a very different part to the journey? Wow and wow, right? My name's Lucy Turner. It's only taken me 50 years. The last time I was here was September for the Stick It to Stigma event, and I turned 50 that month. And it's taken me 50 years to really be able to introduce myself with such clarity and alignment. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm a non-executive director, and I'm what I term an inclusion hooligan. I'm also neurospicy, so I'm bringing autism and ADHD into this room, which is really a quite fascinating combination. My fascination, and on that note, I've just started ADHD meds this week, which is why I've got notes in front of me, because I've got no idea what's going on in my brain, so bear with me. My fascination with business started around the age of 7 when I was in my granddad's barber shop in Barnsley in South Yorkshire, a coal mining village. It grew, and the fascination with gender representation solidified in 1996 when I was studying business studies and I was over on an international assignment in Sweden. Studying gender representation in Sweden is definitely the place to do it. It was a real privilege. So I'm lucky to have 30 years of founding 4 businesses, growing 4 businesses, scaling 4 businesses, and exiting 3 businesses. And now closing 1 business, which is a very different part of the journey. But even better for me, they've all been service businesses. So I've had the opportunity to work with literally hundreds of companies and to be in a real privileged position to observe what leadership and investment in leadership and investment in female leadership looks like. So I'm going to hopefully share some of that today. So as I said, I've got over 3 decades now observing, creating and participating in different initiatives and different interventions that hopefully lead to appropriate gender representation. Some were tried and tested, some were very novel and experimental. Some worked, some definitely didn't, and the ones that didn't really, really backfired, and I think that's something that we can definitely learn from. But today I'm going to talk about a very specific example, which is of a general manager of a German healthcare company who took a very pioneering, progressive and innovative approach. And what she gave was her money, her business money, obviously not her own money, her time, her trust and her faith to really, really try something new in female leadership development. So like any good story, I'm going to start at the beginning, which was in 2015, I sold my first business to what is now a massive healthcare services business. In 2017, I sold my second business to the same company. I did my earn out, I was a good girl, and I stayed for 4 years. They were the hardest 4 years of my life. I was one of 2 females on a board of 9, and I was on my A game in 2020. We were one of the companies that were dedicated to you remember the swabbing people that came around and shoved things? We had 600 people onboarded in 6 weeks to do part of that work. So I felt really proud that in 2020 we contributed. It had its moments, but we contributed something significant. On 2020, I was on my A game. I was my top leader. I had all this wisdom, all this experience, all this investment in me. I was flying. 2020, we all remember, that was a year and a half, wasn't it? COVID. I also moved house twice. I got married. It was a big year. 2021, I crashed and burned. So I'd had repeated burnouts that I'd learnt from, but in 2021, I did it to a whole different level. I was 46. Are there many people around that age in the room? Yeah, let's call it out. Perimenopause hit me. Yes, come on, let's put our hands up. Who's there or around there? Yeah, brutal. And we don't want to make this all about perimenopause. But I experienced every single symptom that there are, and Liz will correct me on this, there are 40 odd, aren't there? I experienced every single one of those, bar one. I'd gone from my A game to not being able to show up for work, never mind to lead the people around me. My boss, a man, white man in his 50s, the only reason I mention that is because the poor chap did not know what to do with me at all. And I had to go and get help myself because the interventions that organisation were never going to help me at that point in my career. What basically happened then was I went and spent a hell of a lot of my own money working with a functional medicine practitioner. She happens to be in the audience, that lady there. and working with her from a women's health clinic to really piece me back together by focusing on the fundamentals that I needed. And they were, guess what? Sleep, movement, nutrition, mindset, and how you put all those things together to combine leadership trait and physiological state. The reason I tell that story is it links to the investment that I saw about a year and a half later. And you mentioned 25 trillion will be accessed. I'm going to tell you the story of two women who could contribute to that 25 trillion. I was 2 years later, I was at a networking event in the life sciences sector with this general manager called Zoe, and she was talking, I told her my story, and she was talking about her CFO and a HR director, and she said they're both gone from that same classic story, early 40s, being on their A game, far from it. Zoe was the woman who had the foresight and the intent to say, what happened to you, Lucy? How did you get back on your A game? And I told her, and I said, so what I'm thinking, and I'm chatting to this Liz lady, why don't we actually support corporates to spend on the stuff that these women actually need at this point in time? And she did. And she spent £30,000 on these two women over the course of 4 months on a physiological-led program, which is scientific, evidence-based, focusing on how they manage their blood glucose, focusing on how they manage their stress response, focusing on how they manage their nervous system. Some really small practical things that enabled those women to show up and lead. And lead again they did. The CFO had a resignation letter written. She was about to hand it in. The HR director had been asked to take on a global project. She couldn't. Within 4 months, they were back, they were flying, they're performing. And it was the impact on what those individual women had in terms of the team dynamic, in terms of the business's ability to hit their targets, in terms of all the great stuff that Zoe said, which I will very quickly summarise for time. The give that Zoe gave, that the cash, the time perspective to put these women through this, and the faith in doing something different. From a business perspective, she said, we observed a clear increase in productivity. The programme not only supported individual well-being, but also strengthened team resilience. It sent a powerful message that we value our people and are committed to supporting them through all stages of life. This programme is more than a health initiative, it's a strategic investment in your people and performance. Now that's give to gain. That's giving for the women themselves, those two women, it's given for the team, it's given for the business. And what happened when those women went home? What happened with their families? What happens with their partners? So bringing us right down to very specifics there in a macro level, but hopefully a good sense of what give to gain can look like differently as we move forward.
Wow, that's amazing. Where do I start? Thank you for sharing this. It's human capital. It all goes back to the idea of, hear me? To looking out for each other. And of course, what makes every organization and the foundation is us, humans. So you are certainly an inclusion hooligan, and you have spoken with brutal honesty, for which I personally thank you for, being a woman of that age myself. I think we must talk about it more and really be open about the changes that happen, not just on a mental and a physical level. I also found it interesting when listening to all three of you that it is very clear that there's a thread emerging between ecosystems, capital, and certainly organizational culture. Pinar, may I return to you? Building on what we have just heard about capital and culture, what does evidence say are the ecosystem conditions that allow these gifts, whether it's resources, network, or leadership, to stick and scale, especially for women founders? And where do ecosystems most commonly break down?
I would say ecosystems, once they get going, once they get going, they typically don't break down because they're built on that win-win logic. But it's very difficult to get them going at the beginning, because you need to get the right people into the same room, create the right momentum, and somebody has to start giving, right? And that's usually a difficult position to be in. And when it comes to female founders and ecosystems, part of what's missing in the ecosystem still is that while the numbers of female founders are going up, and two interesting facts there, entrepreneurship is often a choice that women make when they realize that their corporate job and their responsibilities at home don't work well together, and they want to take control of their life, which makes them quite determined at that, because they have a passion, they choose something that they really want to do, and they make it work. And they're also much more resourceful because they know how to manage a gazillion things at the same time. So that's interesting. And the other part that evidence says is that female-led businesses have a lot more longevity. They're built to stay. And investors are starting to realize that. And so interest in female-led businesses is going up, but what's missing is that the rest of the ecosystem doesn't have enough women. So I think we need more women who invest. We need more angel investors. We need more role models for young girl. I have a 13-year-old who's currently taking care of her brother while I'm here. We need them to realize that entrepreneurship, founding something new, is actually an option, and it's a beautiful thing to do, where they can change the world and follow their passion. And just as a parenthesis, one of the things that I'm trying to give in order to gain for society is telling stories of these women. So we, over at the business school, we started an initiative called Inspiring Female Founders. And the goal of this initiative is to tell as many founder stories as possible. So I'm going to come to you to get to write your stories, and to make them available freely in the world, such that both my daughter can be inspired by a neuroscientist who founded this business to help children, as well as somebody who's building robots over in Silicon Valley, right? And across geographies, across sectors, we need to tell these stories so that younger generations know that this is an option, because it's not part of the education in this culture, nor maybe in Silicon Valley, they know it because it's part of the culture or their parents are involved. But other than that, entrepreneurship is just not taught in school. And so that is one of the things that we're trying to change. If you have the time, check out Inspiring Female Founders. End of pitch.
That sounds great. I certainly will be checking it out. And what is incredible is it doesn't matter how far humanity moves along, it is that word of mouth, the stories, they are the ones that lay out the foundation for encouraging each other, supporting each other, and wanting to move further. So we must never forget and share as much as we can. I completely agree with you. Tara, linking Pinar's ecosystem view, given what she has just shared with us, and Luce's operational lens, how do you adjust investment practice so you're not accidentally reinforcing the same barriers? So let's say on risk, readiness, or reporting burdens. And what is one investing give that shifts power and unlocks compounding interests?
I identified a few layers to this. Obviously, there's the fund level, so allocators, pensions and endowments. A lot of their criteria is creating a paradigm where you do what you always do so you get what you've always gotten. And by that I mean that typically for these large allocators, their due diligence criteria means we'll only back established managers with 20 years of track record. Well, 20 years ago, there were hardly any large women asset managers. So the more you require this multi-decade track record, multiple funds, the more you slim the pool and the longer it takes for women-led funds to catch up. And obviously, the fewer women you have allocating to funds, the fewer you have running funds, the fewer you have deploying to other women. And that's what we can see. I also think at the fund level, as far as fund to venture, we need different products. The current model of just like debt equity, the current focus on VC as the panacea for every enterprise is maligned. And now as we get more and more data from women founders saying, that's not the kind of business I want to build. Maybe I don't want a double hockey stick growth that is going to undermine the planet. And I'm not saying you can't have double hockey stick growth that's not great for the planet. The two can coincide. But we need a better set of financial products. And then finally, we are the change we've been waiting for. We can hold the economy and the market accountable even with our small pensions by what we choose. So yeah, there's already ETFs that put more weight and put pressure on these large companies to consider gender. And the options to angel invest come down into smaller and smaller tickets. And of course, there's still things like crowdfunding. So there's still an opportunity to vote with our dollars at the macro and micro level. And we have to continuously push this narrative and vote with our feet and vote with our voices.
Thank you, completely in agreement with you there. And as you say, this is a little bit of a vicious circle, but it sounds to me that women are beginning to vote with their feet. Now, Lucy, bringing those perspectives together with Pinar's research framing and Tara's capital lens in mind, what does the internal playbook look like to turn support into durable outcomes so equity isn't a project, but a system? And what collaboration has made the biggest difference in turning intent into results in your experience?
Plenty to go out with that one. I think where I'm going to focus initially is just like any form of equity development, we're focusing on gender tonight, but just like any form of equity development, how we get over that cognitive dissonance and drive behavioural change, right? So for me, there are, and McKinsey would agree, funnily enough, there are 4 things, reinforcing mechanisms that consistently move the needle with stuff like this, and we can see them clearly in well-known organisations. So I'm going to give some very big household names to help put it in perspective. Number 1, accountability at the top. So with anything to do with gender, parity, equity, the move to representation, we need the top shouting louder than anywhere else in the organisation. So accountability at the top, number 1. And probably, in my view, and I'd love you to add other examples, but in my view, IKEA, great example. Gender balance targets, funnily enough, going back to the Swedish theme, gender balance targets were tied directly to leadership KPIs and performance reviews far before many organisations. Once representation becomes something that leaders were measured and rewarded on, guess what? We get what we measure. They're not just encouraged to care about it, it's real. And guess what? Senior female representation rose significantly. There's a whole load of data as to support that, but as an example, 48% of their country CEOs were women. Unadjusted gender pay gap to 4%. Yeah, this is cool stuff. The bit when I started digging, I also found out that they actually invested in something called 50/50, a digital tool to help couples balance household responsibilities. Like, how cool is that? Who takes the bins out, you know? Fantastic. So IKEA, accountability at the top. The next piece, very clear, transparency in progression and pay, to your point. L'Oreal is the example here. They transformed advancement by making promotion criteria, talent pay pipelines, and pay equity data far more transparent. This reduced that informal gatekeeping that we all know goes on and created those much clearer pathways into leadership. In 2023, women represented 50% of their board members. How cool would that be if that was the majority of organisations that we work with? They also used the economic dividend for gender equity, and they eliminated gender pay gap in France, cool stuff, by 2019. So again, well ahead of their time. The third thing, we hear a lot about mentorship, aren't we, and giving our female leaders mentors. It's not about that, it's about sponsorship. Mentorship is reactive, Typically, sponsorship is that proactive approach. So the best example, not the best, a good example here is Unilever, who implemented structured sponsorship programs where senior leaders are really accountable for actively advocating for high potential women and opening doors to those really stretched roles, the ones that's going to really, really push them forward. And this shifted progression from that passive support to active advancement. Another good example, they're achieving gender balance, 50-50 gender balance in 2020, a year ahead of their own schedule. So again, showing that intent. And then the final one, number 4, redesigning leadership norms for sustainability. So I've talked a little bit about that, and my goodness, it's great to have a female founder at the start of that investment journey in the room, at least one, listening to this story. But the best example here for me comes from a world that I'm very familiar with life sciences, and we've all probably heard about Novartis and their unbossed culture. So that, when you think about what that was, it's that redefining leadership away from that constantly on. Like, as women, it is harder to be constantly on for many reasons, which we can probably have a whole different section on. But moving towards trust, towards energy management and outcomes, that real measurable impact on retaining and advancing their senior leaders. And it worked. In the UK alone, we worked with that organisation. December 25, 60% of the UK workforce is female. And when I look at what it is that they've done, it's all around their managers walking the talk. So when we think about McKinsey's 4 big ways to change, the building blocks of change, they're doing all those good stuff. They're making sure that they're role modelling. I see my leaders and colleagues behaving differently. I'm fostering understanding and conviction. I understand what's been asked of me and it makes sense. Developing talent and skills, I have the opportunities to behave in the new way, and reinforcing with formal mechanisms. That's the good stuff that they're doing and the experience that people have with their managers day in, day out. So the common thread across all these examples is simple. Equity improves when organisations change the systems, when they change the incentives and change the leadership expectations. So there's nothing crazy in there. It's just a reinforcement of the good stuff works.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So I'm hearing across this conversation today, driving behavioral change. That is probably one of the hardest things we have to work on day in, day out. Have those difficult conversations, which I think sometimes can be fun, because the amount of information that I'm getting tonight is going to make me go and look up these amazing initiatives that you have mentioned. And let me also pause here for a moment, because I'd like to step back from the discussion for a second, because one thing has become clear to me. When we talk about giving tonight, we are not talking about giving us charity. We're talking about giving. Oh, can you hear me now? No? That's better. We're talking about giving us a strategy. And a strategy that, whether through capital, capability, or culture, means that we have to collaborate. And this is a mechanism through which impact multiplies. So I really thank you for sharing these stories with me and the audience tonight. But there's one more thing I would love to hear your views on tonight. And perhaps we could take around 90 seconds to 2 minutes each and talk about myth busting. What is... Excuse me. I'm going to... Yes. Is this better? Okay, let's talk about myth busting. Wow. So, what is one myth that you want to retire about gender equity and social impact, especially in entrepreneurship, investing, and purpose-led organization? And Lucy, perhaps can I start with you on this one?
You can. And it's so ironic, because the myth I'd really like to bust this evening is that the biggest barrier to women's leadership is imposter syndrome. And it's quite ironic, because I will share, when I sat on our prep call a month or so ago, I don't get imposter syndrome very often, but I came off that call and I was like, I phoned Judy and I'm going, crikey, it's real, right? But it's not that real. And the reason I say that is, in reality, in my career and all the the amazing privilege I've had to sit and listen to some very senior women, those senior women are not sitting in boardrooms thinking, I don't belong here. They're thinking, I'm exhausted. They're thinking, I'm carrying all these roles. I'm getting quite emotional now because it's real. They're thinking, I'm operating in a system that's designed around someone else's life and not mine. And the obsession with imposter syndrome has become a very convenient narrative because it places the problem inside the women rather than inside the workplaces. It suggests the solution is more confidence training, more resilience workshops. I've been there, I've been sent on all those. They were the last thing I needed. I didn't need more, I needed less. I needed to lay down and protect my nervous system. But the real issue isn't that women doubt themselves. It's that many leadership cultures still quietly reward that constant availability. They still quietly reward that overwork is commitment, that there's masculine code leadership norms, and that they're ignoring, to our new venture, the biological realities like the caregiving cycles and the hormone health. And that's not just about perimenopause, that's about your 13-year-old daughter about to, my 16-year-old daughter's gone to do a maths and chemistry mock today. She started a period this morning. That's a reality, right? I wasn't planning on using that example, but there we go. So the more honest framing is, women don't have a confidence problem, they have a sustainability problem. And when leadership systems are designed to be sustainable for women, confidence stops being the issue entirely. And I'm grateful to you all for supporting that.
The myth I'd like to bust, and it's framed also within the broader universe of what you cited, is that there's a trade-off. Our ecosystem is always framing it, and if you talk to your average investor, they're still framing it as if there's a trade-off between return and impact. And I admit that sometimes there can be, we have a partner that's deploying in the Amazon. Well, yes, it's a lower return, but we really need to save the Amazon. There's some cases where that's the case, but there's so many cases where it's not a return, where it's actually synergistic. And the stats on women's performance show that. And yet, at the same time, we exist within this broader system where, there's just not enough networks of support. There's not enough safety nets. We're in a system that is pushing always for growth and growth and growth. And by the way, does that narrative fit when we have so many other things going wrong in the planet? So I say that there's not a trade-off, but I also wonder if it's not worth examining, do we always need to push for growth in the first place? Does that always serve us? And maybe that's also part of voting with our feet.
So I think similarly, I loved both of these comments, but I'm going to think and try to bust the myth about women being able to do it all. Nobody can do it all. And I think that and I also think that we are now in a transition period where women are empowered, they're in boards, they're founders, they're becoming business leaders, but their home situation hasn't changed. And if you have time, watch this graduation speech from the US by Shonda Rhimes. You probably know who that is. And what she says is, so she goes like, one of the questions that people ask me as a single mother of 3, Shonda, how do you do it all? And she says, I don't. Every time I'm writing something or producing a new TV series, I'm missing my daughter's recital. I'm not reading a bedtime story to my son. Every time I'm at a soccer match, I'm missing an important business deal. There's no such thing as being able to do it all. And if we don't change the home environment and don't go towards that 50-50 thing that I'm going to look that up in Sweden, we won't be able to do it all. And so I agree that we have to take care of ourselves because the society is exhausting us.
Thank you very much. Thank you to my wonderful, wonderful speakers today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And I'm going to wrap up in a different way than I planned, because you brought up another part of this very important topic, and that's men, male allies that we have. And on this note, I would like to say that I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Professor Mickey, but I have been at Kellogg for 17 years. I've done my math, so a very long time. And yes, Professor Mickey is now my boss, but he was my supervisor during my DPhil. And it's a personal story. It took me 7 years to do my DPhil, and I had 2 children throughout that I took care of myself, and I needed some time off, and sometimes it was difficult. But there was not a moment in time when I could not go to my supervisor, to the president of our college, and say, this is actually what is happening. What can I do? And that has made all the difference. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart for those opportunities. And thank you for actually being so forward-thinking about how you treat the staff at the college and your students and your colleagues. We're all grateful for that. Now, it is wonderful to have covered so many topics, and I know we could be talking for a very long time. But the outcome of today is that we all contribute to stronger organizations, more resilient economies, and more inclusive innovation systems. And it brings a lot of joy to my heart, and I'm sure to yours, that everyone here understands that it is only through collaboration and conversation that we can reach the outcomes that benefit not only women, but society, communities, and just global well-being overall. I thank you all for being here. I would like to give a big hand of applause for our speakers who have so generously given time to us today. And thank you very much for sharing your stories. And I very much hope to see you all again at Kellogg very, very soon. Have a good evening and a safe trip back home.